Aloha and welcome to HANA Kakou, a weekly program on the ThinkTech Hawaii Broadcasting Network. I'm Joe Kent, Vice President of the Grassroots Institute of Hawaii, and I want to welcome you to the show. You know, recently I've been thinking a lot about disaster movies. I've kind of had some dreams of disaster movies. Maybe it's the Jurassic Park trailer they keep playing. But actually, there is a disaster movie, well, some say there is a disaster movie in Hawaii's future, a real disaster. And Paul Harleman is the Senate Minority Budget Director. So, Paul, a real disaster movie for Hawaii? Well, what's that?
Well, you know, like recently the legislature passed a $26 billion budget, and currently, actually, we are in a deficit position, meaning that we're spending more money than we take in as revenues. And if that continues in the future, then we could face a fiscal cliff.
I see. So we're spending more than we're taking in.
Correct.
And that's going to push Hawaii over what people call a fiscal cliff. What does that mean?
Well, currently, what it means is that, you know, like the state government operates through, you know, like a state government collects revenues, of course, and it spends money. Currently, we have about $800 million in our bank account. So if we continue to overspend, then that amount will be reduced every single year.
Okay, so you're talking about Hawaii's budget, and lots of people, when they hear about the budget, they start to glaze over. You hear all these numbers thrown at you, and you start to fall asleep. But so why should people care about the budget?
Well, because, I mean, again, like, you know, everyone pays taxes, of course.
Okay.
And first of all, so, you know, the budget implements public policy, of course. So it has a real impact, and it, you know, especially when we're overspending, it will affect the day-to-day taxpayer.
So the more the government spends, the more the taxpayer is taxed. Is that correct?
Correct.
And what happens if the budget goes over the fiscal cliff? The taxpayer is taxed a lot then, or?
Well, we are already overtaxed, in my opinion, here in Hawaii. You know, just by going to the store, we pay a GET, general exercise taxes, on everything that we actually buy.
About 4%.
It's about 4%, and that actually increased because of the real project, so that went up in Honolulu. So that affects everyone.
Okay, but that's what's going on right now.
Correct.
But in our disaster budget movie, where Hawaii does fall off the fiscal cliff perhaps in the future, what would that look like? So let's imagine Hawaii is going along fine. One day the budget is steady as it is now, and then one day, what, the stock market crashes, or what happens?
Yeah, that scenario actually happened in 2009 during the economic crisis. Okay. What happened is right after the stock market crashed in 2009, the global tourism market crashed. That affected the local economy here in Hawaii, and actually tax revenues declined by about 10%. So the state legislature in 2009 was faced with a $1 billion budget deficit.
I see. So all of a sudden, less tourists come to Hawaii, and tax revenues go way down.
Correct.
And down below, what our assumptions were.
Correct. Well, no, but I don't think any economist foresaw that we were going into that 2009 crash. But we were definitely not, we were not ready for it as a state. We didn't have any fiscal reserves at that time. So it was a real disaster, and that was a real fiscal cliff that could happen again in the future.
And right now we've been building back from that disaster movie back in 2009. Where are we today? Are we okay, or?
Fiscally, I think we are pretty stable. We have a pretty good bond rating. We do learn from 2009, so under the leadership of the previous administration and the previous budget director, Mr. Colbert Young, the state actually recapitalized their fiscal reserves as the economy was growing. As we grew out of the recession, We did put more money in our fiscal reserves.
Fiscal reserve is just in case.
Just in case, exactly, because the economy is cyclical, of course, and we've been
cyclical, meaning it goes up and down, and it goes up and down. Okay.
Correct. So we had the 2009 recession. We're actually in fiscal year 2016 right now. So we've had a pretty stable period of economic growth, but that sooner or later we will head into a recession again.
I see. So it's a cycle. So we go up and down, and now we're going up.
Correct.
And what goes up must come down, right?
Correct. So sooner or later, most economies, most people would agree that within the year, within the next 5 years, we will most likely head into a period of slower economic growth. And as a state, we have to be ready for that fiscally.
Okay, so the economists are predicting a downward trend perhaps in the future. And the government is predicting what, an upward trend? Or are they preparing for this downward stuff? Or
currently, we don't see any evidence of that in the state budget. And we at the Senate minority are very concerned about the current trend of overspending. Like you said, because we have to be ready for a potential recession in the next 5 years. And if we continue to overspend, we will continue to deplete our fiscal reserves. Okay,
but you sound like a pessimist now. So is it good to be pessimistic, or do you think the state is overly optimistic?
I think we are in the assumptions that are made as part of the 6-year financial plan that the governor has to submit to the legislature. I think the financial assumptions that are made with respect to state revenues and expenditures are overly optimistic, in my opinion.
All right, but is this realistic though? There's a lot of people who don't like hearing this doom and gloom stuff, and they say, oh, why are you saying that the economy is going to crash? It looks great, my stocks look great, everything's going up, and this would never happen in Hawaii. But look at what happened in Detroit. Detroit went bankrupt. They were even, and they have a population that's even bigger than Hawaii or it was bigger at 1.8 million people. Hawaii has 1.4 million people. And then they went into a $20 billion bankruptcy, and nobody could predict it. After that, the population cut in half. Unemployment went up to 12%. We saw abandoned houses, drugs and crime, and 1 million people left the city. Now, that's a city that went bankrupt. Could the state go bankrupt too, Hawaii?
Well, in strictly legal terms, states cannot go bankrupt, legally speaking. But that doesn't mean that a similar scenario could happen in Hawaii as a state, of course. And, globally speaking, we see the same thing happening right now in Europe with Greece, of course. That is, legally speaking, Greece is not bankrupt. But again, they have this huge debt that they have to pay, and the money has to come from somewhere.
So Hawaii would look more like Greece than Detroit?
It will look more like Greece.
And what does that look like?
Well, in a way, we're not in the same situation as Greece. I don't think we're there yet. But in Greece, what's happening right now is they will have to bargain with their bondholders at the moment. So they can't, financially, they can't repay their debt. Actually, and their economy isn't growing fast enough, so there's no way that they can actually repay their debt. So they have to negotiate with their debt holders at the moment, and that's what's happening.
Okay, and so in Hawaii, okay, well, first of all, in Detroit, they could just go bankrupt. But in Hawaii, states don't go bankrupt, right?
Yeah, and legally speaking, yeah.
So the way to fix their financial crisis is to raise taxes. Is that
or
correct?
to grow the economy.
Or
and
to grow
taxes,
the economy.
The tax revenues are dependent upon the strength of the economy.
How much would taxes go up, do you think?
Well, if we continue, it's difficult to
Let's say like a worst case scenario. People say that we have unfunded liability crisis, $30 billion in unfunded liabilities in Hawaii, and divided per resident in Hawaii, that would be something like $21,000 per person. Are those the kinds of taxes increases that we would see, or?
Well, not necessarily.
Okay.
But yeah, we have a $20 billion unfunded liability for the state's retirement fund and the health insurance fund. Now what's happening at the moment is that the state pays about $1.4 billion every year to repay that unfunded liability over a period of 20 years. So we don't necessarily have to pay that immediately, but to go back to your question, what could happen and what most likely what will happen in the next decade or so, if we continue on the path of overspending, I believe that our general exercise taxes will probably have to be raised by maybe 1%, maybe 2%. And that's a doomsday scenario, in my opinion, because that affects day-to-day taxpayers.
Okay, but what about the people who say, all right, the GE tax is at 4%. In a doomsday scenario, it goes up 1%. So 1% doesn't sound like a lot. Is it a lot?
It doesn't sound like a lot, but in absolute terms, I believe that 1% on an annual basis for the average taxpayer, that could mean that you end up spending maybe $200 or $300 more, because again, the general exercise tax is based upon everything that we purchase.
It's everything that. So if I buy a stick of gum, or if I buy groceries, or anything from the store, it's all taxed on that.
Correct.
And everything in between business transactions is also taxed. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so it's a tax that sort of snowballs to hit the consumer in the end. Is that
correct? Yeah.
Okay.
So it might seem very small, but it adds up, and it's bad for the economy, in my opinion, and it actually hurts businesses as more than it does consumers.
So that little 4% is like a snowball that starts an avalanche, and now we have a 5%, which is a bigger snowball that starts an even bigger avalanche in the future. Oh, interesting. What else might happen instead of, besides just raising the GE tax, if we had to pay for
Well, we have
prices?
other taxes, of course. We have personal income taxes, and we have TAT tax, which is levied upon hotels. So we can, so again, the legislature could raise, they could raise the GE, they could raise the personal income tax, or the TAT tax. Those three taxes combined account for about 80% of state revenues.
What's wrong with raising the TAT tax?
Well, that will hurt our tourism industry, of course, because that means that the hotel rooms, the prices for the hotel rooms will go up, and at some point in time, tourists might look for different markets. If it becomes too expensive, then tourists might go somewhere else.
I was just talking to a wedding couple that came to Hawaii yesterday. They're my good friends. They're visiting, and they said, well, we were debating about going to Hawaii or the Caribbean, because Hawaii, it was just so expensive. We couldn't afford to stay here. But then they had a friend who had a house that they could stay in, so that's the reason they chose Hawaii.
Yeah.
So right there, to your point, the TAT tax, as it goes up, it discourages tourism.
Yeah, definitely. And it's not only, tourists pay TAT, and then there's GET. So it definitely adds up, and I believe that in terms of the average prices for a hotel room in Hawaii, that at some point in time we're just not going to be as competitive anymore if we continue to increase the TAT tax.
Interesting. Well, my guest today is Paul Harleman, Senate Minority Budget Director. When we come back, we're going to talk about solutions to the budget crisis. Don't go away.
This is Alice Lee Hagan, host of ThinkTech Hawaii Business Education Spotlight. My show here at ThinkTech Hawaii is every Thursday from 3 to 4 in the afternoon. I bring in interesting guests from Hawaii, the mainland, and hopefully international guests in the future. Do join us on Thursday from 3 to 4 p.m. ThinkTech Hawaii Business Education Spotlight. Aloha.
Hi, aloha. My name is Chris Leatham, and I host a show called The Economy and You. The show plays every Wednesday at noon, and on my show, I bring on guests who are interested or working in the technology space. And so I'd like you to come and watch the show and learn with me about all the sort of exciting things that we're doing in Hawaii to build and grow our economy ecosystem. So I'd like to say aloha, and I look forward to seeing you on the show. Thank you.
Welcome back to HANA Kakou on the ThinkTech Hawaii Broadcasting Network. And HANA Kakou means let's work together. And we're working together today with Paul Harleman, Senate Minority Budget Director. But first I want to say thank you to the ThinkTech Hawaii staff and their producer, Jay Fidel. Thank you so much for bringing all this great content to the world. And if you'd like to visit them, you can visit www.thinktechhawaii.com. Now before the break, if you're just joining us, we were talking about Hawaii's fiscal cliff, which actually looks kind of like a doomsday scenario. I kind of imagine people running in the streets. But actually, in real terms, it would be a doomsday scenario for Hawaii's pocketbook. We're here with Paul Harleman, Senate Minority Budget Director. Welcome. Now, what would, we talked about going over the fiscal cliff and what that would look like. So how can we, how can we save that? How can we save the day?
Well, I think we have a real opportunity here today to cut spending. And the legislature recently passed a $26 billion budget for fiscal years 2016 and 17. That already happened. Now the executive branch, under leadership of the Governor Ige, they have a real opportunity here to use executive power to cut spending as well. So the governor doesn't necessarily have to release all of the funds. And I think in our current situation, we have a real risk of a future recession, and we really need to balance our budget immediately. So we do have an opportunity. The E administration, if they want to, they can cut spending.
I see. So even though the budget has been passed, they can still make cuts. Is that correct? Correct.
The governor could withhold spending. That happened under the previous administration when revenues, when the revenue forecast was adjusted downward, meaning that we were expecting less revenues to come in. Last year, the budget director imposed a 10% spending restriction on general fund appropriations, and that saved taxpayers about about 95 million over that particular fiscal year, which was 2015. So if the current administration does that, if we continue those 10% spending restrictions, then again, taxpayers could save another 100 million.
So a spending restriction is just saying to the governor, we're not going to spend past this line. Is that correct?
Correct. So the way it works is a budget is passed, and the budget authorizes expenditures. Then the money is being released on a quarterly schedule. So if the governor wants to, he can release 90%.
I see.
Instead of 100%.
He can ratchet back.
He can ratchet back if he wants to, if
and
there's a reason for it.
And another way to cut is collective bargaining. How does that work?
Well, collective bargaining, this year the state spent about $566 million, I believe, on collective bargaining contracts for state workers. So collective bargaining means that, like state workers, they have unions and they bargain with the governor for pay raises, for pension contributions, and for health insurance payments.
How often do they bargain?
Well, the last contracts, I believe the last contract that was signed was by the by the Hawaii State Teachers Union.
Okay.
So there's different unions for different types of state workers. And
this year we've got big collective bargaining.
Well, the contracts, the main contracts were negotiated last year, and they expire in fiscal year 2016. So again, next year the governor will have to sit down with the union leaders to come up with a collective bargaining agreement for future years.
When the unions, now I used to be part of the union, when they sit down at the table, with the government, and they do this collective bargaining. Does it tend to go in favor of the union, or does it go in favor of the taxpayer usually?
Well, in our opinion, at the Senate minority, we think that that the collective bargaining process is skewed, and it's more in favor, that the unions have more leverage over the executive when they go into these collective bargaining
So it tends to
negotiations.
increase spending. These collective bargaining agreements tend to increase spending. Is
Correct.
The trend that we've seen.
That's the trend, definitely.
And you're saying that if we didn't increase spending as much during these collective bargaining agreements, that could save a lot of money. Is that
That
what
could
we're
save
saying?
a lot of money, correct.
Okay.
If there were, for example, what we favor at the Senate minority is we would like to see a cap on collective bargaining, something that has recently, I believe a couple of years ago, Act 10 passed in Wisconsin. And we want to see something similar where we have a cap on collective bargaining, because, quite frankly, we just can't afford to pay for these pay raises.
I see. That in the Senate alternative budget would be the biggest way to save money. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
We introduced a alternative budget last year, like we do every year.
Where can people find that, by the way?
You can find it on, we have a website, HawaiiAlternativeBudget.com, and also on the Senate Minority website. We introduced an alternative budget last year that included $1.5 billion less spending in comparison to the governor. Now, that's very important, and one of the biggest savings that we have was we did not provide any funding for these collective bargaining increases because we believe that we cannot afford it. We have the highest cost of living in the U.S. Our average taxpayers are struggling, so we don't just cut spending for the sake of cutting. We actually introduced a tax relief plan had 4 elements. Number one, we actually exempted food from the general exercise tax.
Okay, well, wait a second. You're saying that if we cut enough, then we have enough money for a surplus or to provide taxpayers some relief. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
I think that's definitely necessary. And that was our main goal last session, was to how do we lower the cost of living here in Hawaii? The only way to do that is by lowering our taxes. And that's what we did with our budget, and we actually showed that we can lower our taxes and we can lower our cost of living.
So the first question I asked you, why should anyone care about the budget? Because it affects the cost of living.
It affects the cost of living ultimately.
Okay, some other cuts that, well, now that we're on a cutting spree,
Yeah.
what are some other cuts that we can make? I see that in the alternative budget, you have consolidating health care. What does that mean?
Correct, yeah. Well,
35.7 million.
what we
saved.
believe is, how we can save money in the budget is by looking at administrative programs and perhaps merging them. So one of the ideas that we have was to consolidate administrative programs within the Department of Health and Human Services. We believe that there's a lot of waste in those programs, and that if you merge those administrative programs, that at the end of the day, you'll be more efficient and you'll save money.
And
doing so.
and 8.2 million cutting other government programs.
We looked at some
priority
low
things.
priority programs that we cut, but all combined with, again, collective bargaining is the biggest element. With collective bargaining and by looking at government, looking at waste, and by merging administrative programs, we believe that we can cut the state budget significantly.
Mm-hmm. But well, what about this though? If I'm hearing all this talk about cutting, and what about people who say, well, we're cutting to the bone in Hawaii. We can't cut anymore. And if we cut these things, people need these government services. So if you're cutting, isn't that going to hurt people as well?
It depends what we're cutting, of course. Again, we're not cutting for the sake of cutting. Our goal is very clear. We want to see less government spending. We want to see less taxes because, quite frankly, we have to. If you want to reduce the cost of living, you have to start with the budget, and we have to cut taxes. That's why we're cutting. And I don't think I think denying collective bargaining increases. I don't think that will hurt taxpayers.
You're not lowering collective bargaining contracts, right? So you're just cutting the increases.
Correct. You're just cutting the increases.
Okay.
Correct.
And what that does is it lowers the cost of living for everyone else in Hawaii. Well, for everyone,
if we implement our tax relief plan, it will. Mm-hmm. Just as an example, like if we were to exempt food from the general excise tax, that will save the average family of four almost $500 a year. So that really helps the middle class, and it helps people at the bottom. So that's why those policies, again, we've been introducing that bill for the last 5 years. It could be implemented. And if we cut smart, if we locate waste, and if we make smart fiscal choices, those type of policies could be implemented.
So not only could we pull back from the fiscal cliff, we could also make life better for many of Hawaii's citizens living here, trying to struggle to pay taxes and pay increased costs for, well, basically everything in Hawaii. Paul, I want to talk a little bit more about the unfunded liability crisis. This is something that is another one of these things where people just glaze over. But if you imagine a giant a tank of water or something, and this is the tank, the employee retirement system, the tank that everyone takes money out. Now the tank is only 60% full, some people say. Yeah. And if the tank is not filled, then our retirees, our public retirees, will be faced with, well, less payments for their pensions, which were promised to them. But Hawaii passed a bill, or passed a law to guarantee that this tank would be filled to the top. Is that correct? Or?
Correct.
Okay.
2 years ago, I believe, Act 268 passed, which requires that the legislature makes mandatory payments to pay off that liability every year.
Act 268 says that the tank has to be full. The employee retirement system has to be full no matter what. And then what about everything else? So if this is the first priority, then what about everything else? Everything else comes secondary?
Everything else comes secondary, exactly. And you know, it's a massive amount that we're spending every year. Like I said earlier, $1.4 billion every year. That's about 25%, or about 15% of the state's general fund. So that's a massive amount. That's actually more than we spend on education in terms of general funds. So it's a massive amount. And
education is one of the biggest items in the budget.
Correct.
It's even more than that, you're saying.
Correct. And what really concerns me is recently in the news we learned that HMSA, one of the biggest insurance companies here in Hawaii, that they actually increased their premiums by 50%. So that's a significant amount. Again, that will have an impact on regular citizens, small businesses, but it will also have an impact on the state.
Well, I want to get into some of that after the break. Thanks for watching us. This is HANA Kakou on the ThinkTech Hawaii Broadcasting Network. We'll be back.
Here's the deal. I'm Jay Fidel. I'm the host of Hawaii, the State of Clean Energy, which is the Energy Policy Forum's program on Wednesday. That's how we call Wednesday Energy Wednesday. We call it Energy Wednesday every Wednesday. Are you surprised? Okay, and we try to get guys like Jim Alberts here from Hawaiian Electric who can tell us what's really going on in energy. We want to be informed. It's so important. It's the most important initiative in our state. Clean energy is major, okay? And that's why we cover it on this show. That's the deal. What do you think, Sharon?
I think that's great. That's why we're here every Wednesday from 4 to 5, and we hope you all join us so we can hear people like Jim coming on our show and co-host Ray Starling from Hawaii Energy.
Okay, Jim, you've been here today. You've seen this. You heard what she said. What do you think?
I think it's a tremendous opportunity for people to come together and talk about the issues. oftentimes there isn't a good forum to bring these key issues out into the public, and this is a tremendous way to go about it. And the activity of this show is essential to keep talking about energy, because as you said, it's such an essential part of our lives that we need to pay attention to it, and we need to think about the future.
Okay, Ray, your turn.
Well, this is a special time in the history of Hawaii where we're making some pretty radical changes in the way we use energy and generate energy. And this show is the one place you can count on coming to every Wednesday and hearing something about the latest issues that are on the table, being discussed, that will affect us all going forward. So come join us, and if you have some ideas you want to share with us about energy, give us a call and let us know. We'll put you up here and let you talk for an hour. So come see us.
Thanks, Ray. Thanks, Sharon. Thanks, Jim. It's great to be, from ThinkTech's point of view, it's great to have this show. We love the show. It's our most important show. So come around and listen to us 4 to 5 on Wednesday. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Aloha.
Aloha.
Aloha. Welcome to HANA Kakou on the ThinkTech Hawaii Broadcasting Network. I'm Joe Kent, Vice President of the Grassroots Institute, and today we're here with Paul Harleman, Senate Minority Budget Director. We're talking about a movie today, a disaster movie in Hawaii. Not a real movie, but a real disaster that could happen with Hawaii's FiscalCliff. Welcome again, Paul, to the show. We went over what would happen if Hawaii went over the FiscalCliff. Lots of people would be hurt and probably raise taxes in Hawaii. Then we went over some solutions to trying to solve that problem, which a lot of them involved lowering taxes and I guess lowering spending, I guess. And now we're talking a little bit about one of the sort of big problems in the budget, which is the unfunded liability crisis that we're seeing. The unfunded liabilities in Hawaii are about, it's about 60% underfunded right now, the employee retirement system. Nationally, we see that across the nation. There's about a $4 trillion unfunded liability across the United States. When we hear these numbers, 4 trillion, 30 billion, what does that mean to the average person then? Why should anyone care about that?
Well, because our tax dollars, because again, we have to pay taxes, and if we see more and more of our tax dollars go to these unfunded liabilities, that means that we will see less spending in critical areas, such as infrastructure, education.
And more of our tax money is going to these areas.
Unfortunately, it is, yeah.
Because of, Paul mentioned, a law called Act 268, which means that our tax money has to primarily go to the employer retirement system first before it goes to anything else.
Correct. So, yeah, exactly. The state will have to pay it.
And we're paying more and more every year into the ERS fund.
Correct.
So what does that mean for the future of Hawaii?
Well, it means that we will see probably there is almost no room left in the budget, and that's what we saw this year already. So we will see probably less investments in critical areas again, such as infrastructure, education, healthcare. So we will see less spending in those areas because we are prioritizing our payments for the state retirement fund and healthcare fund.
So because we have to pay for this, we can't pay for that, and we're pushed up against the wall as far as the budget goes.
Exactly, and that's what we saw this year. It's very, very difficult. There's almost no money left, and at some point, we have to cut spending in other areas, or the legislature will have to increase taxes.
You mentioned that healthcare costs are going up. So what is that? Does that have anything to do with the budget?
It does have a lot to do with the budget. As a result of the Affordable Care Act that was passed, again, as I mentioned earlier, HMSA increased their premiums by 50%. And the state is an employer too. So the state pays for the health insurance for state workers. So they will have to go into the private market and buy these insurance plans for state workers. So at some point in time, if those premiums continue to increase, then that means that more of our tax dollars will go towards paying for health insurance for state workers, for current state workers as well as retired state workers. So in a way, what we're seeing right now in the insurance market with these premium increases, it will affect probably the next budget. Not this budget for the next 2 years, but down the road in 2018 and 19. If those premiums continue to increase, then it will definitely impact the budget as well.
But can't we just, well, this is HMSA, which is a government, a private government insurance agency, is that correct?
It's a nonprofit, but it is a private insurance company.
Okay, and why is their insurance going up?
Well, as a result, they indicated in their statement that their premiums went up because of the Affordable Care Act, because there are more people insured at the moment, and people with pre-existing conditions are now, insurance companies will have to insure them. They cannot deny them. So there's a bigger pool of individuals that need health services.
So, okay, so that's the way insurance works is if some people, well, I guess the more sick people that are in the pool, the more insurance goes up. And now that, well, it sounds sad to say this, but the more sick people that have been allowed into the pool, the more insurance has risen up across the board. That's just a fact of insurance. And because of that, the government has to pay for that.
The government, my point was that the government, that the state is an employer, and the state, as an employer, they are required to buy health insurance for state workers. Just as any other employer, the state will have to buy these plans. So if the premiums go up, that means more expenditures for the state as well.
Well, but of course there's a whole conversation there about, don't we need to insure people with pre-existing conditions? And don't we, isn't that sort of a moral and human obligation to do? So what do you say to people who say, well, we need insurance costs to rise to pay for the people who can't pay for themselves?
Yeah, that's a policy decision that was made at the federal level. Quite frankly, we don't have a choice at the moment. So we do have the insurance companies at the moment, they have to insure individuals with pre-existing conditions.
Okay, so even if you concede and say, that's right, we do want to pay for these extra people, well, that's still something we need to deal with in many other ways, perhaps. Is that correct?
That's correct. I think that it is a fact that those premiums are going up, and we, the Senate minority, believe that we got to factor that into the state's financial plan, and we got to plan for those increases accordingly by cutting spending today.
Across the states, have you seen states that have pulled back from their fiscal cliffs, or is that something that you study right now?
I'm not exactly sure what you...
Like, right now, many states are in an unfunded liability crisis. There are some states whose budgets are very good and A+, and other states who are much less, like Hawaii.
I think a lot of states are actually are in a similar situation as Hawaii at the moment. What we see a lot of budget deficits. The reason for that is that when we came out of our recession in 2009, our economy was growing. Because we were at the bottom, and then tax revenues were growing very significantly. I think with like 9 to like 12% every year. So our assumptions that we made, we were relying on our revenues to continue to grow at that rate. And actually most states did. Right after the recession, they increased spending significantly, and they were relying on overly optimistic revenue assumptions.
Right after the recession?
Right after the recession, yeah. So, and we are still, the U.S. economy is strong, it is growing, it's doing a lot better than Europe, but I guess the revenue assumptions that certain states make were a little bit too optimistic. So they increased their spending, assuming that revenues will come in at a certain level. And unfortunately,
Well,
again, we were overly optimistic that that didn't happen. And at the same time, a lot of states did not reduce their budgets.
but what about people who say, well, Hawaii is different? Hawaii is protected from these business cycles, the booms and the busts, and because we're an island out in the middle of the Pacific, we've got tourism that we're relying on, we're not affected as much as other places by an economic crash. Is that true, or?
No, that's definitely not true. Our economy is very integrated into the global market because we rely on tourism as our main industry. So what happens internationally does have a significant impact on our economy. And because of that, it also affects our state government.
So when an economic crash happens in the nation, Hawaii is the first place that people cut. They cut maybe their vacation
Maybe they cut their
house
vacations, that's
right.
correct. And that's exactly what we saw in 2009 during the crisis.
Well, it looks like we've got 60% funded employer retirement system. We were talking about that earlier. And I just wonder, where did the money go? I mean, if we're behind on our payments, what happened?
Well, what happened is that, again, it's a systematic problem that we're seeing, that we tend to, as a state government, we tend to ignore future expenditures. So back in the 80s and back in the 90s, I believe it was in the 80s when when those promises were made, the state legislature didn't account for it. So in other words, they didn't set money aside every year. So they made promises, but they didn't fund those promises. And that's why it's called unfunded liability. So it's not that the money went elsewhere, it's just that we didn't account for it. We completely ignored it, and as most states did. And that's why we're seeing this massive liability, of $20 billion for the employment retirement system and the health insurance fund, because we didn't set enough money aside over time. And we're taking that responsibility today, but the sad thing about it is that current taxpayers are paying for something that they don't really enjoy. So in other words, we're paying for pensions and health insurance benefits for only because the previous generation didn't take their fiscal responsibility and
Paul,
set a lot of money aside.
When you look at the whole picture, Hawaii up next against a cliff, about to topple over, and there's a way to pull back, what would your biggest piece of advice be to Hawaii's policymakers?
I think that we have to be very prudent, and we have to really look at our financial plan very carefully. And if we make modest cuts today in our budget, it will definitely have a significant payoff over the long term. So we don't want to see what happened in 2009, where we made drastic budget cuts. We saw furloughs. That was a real doomsday scenario because we didn't prepare for a future recession to happen. I think we are in a good position today, and if we make modest cuts, I think it will have a significant payoff.
The future disaster could be real, or a bright future could also be real, depending on what we do.
Correct. As long as we are prepared, and that's really the key. And at the moment, unfortunately, we look at our budget. Our position is that it's a bit irresponsible to spend more money than we take in. So we gotta cut our spending, and we gotta balance our budget. And that's something we can do today. Either the governor can do it, take an executive action, or the legislature next year could amend the budget.
Well, thank you so much, Paul Harleman. That was educational, to say the least. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joe.
And thank you for watching our program, HANA Kakou, on the ThinkTech Hawaii Broadcasting Network. I'm Joe Kent, Vice President of the Grassroots Institute, and we'll see you next time.